There is a map that most people will never see. It sits in a vault somewhere between Moscow and Beijing, drawn with lines that could move millions of people without them ever leaving their homes. The question isn't whether this map exists. The question is what happens when the world finds out. In the autumn of 2023, a leaked diplomatic memo surfaced in Brussels containing references to what officials called alternative cartographic assessments of Central Asian borders. The document suggested that China and Russia had been quietly conducting joint surveys of contested mountain passes and river valleys along the borders of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. These aren't random places. They sit at the crossroads of three empires, where Soviet-era boundaries were drawn hastily in the 1920s and never fully resolved. The timing matters because these nations are now critical to global trade, rare earth minerals, and water resources that feed hundreds of millions of people downstream. If borders shift here, the ripple effects reach from the Caspian Sea to the South China Sea. This isn't history. This is happening now. The roots go back to when Stalin's cartographers carved up Central Asia into 5 republics. They drew borders that deliberately split ethnic groups and communities, creating dependencies that would keep everyone loyal to Moscow. Villages were cut in half. Irrigation systems crossed 3 different territories. The borders were designed to be impossible to separate. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, these absurd borders became international boundaries overnight. Kazakhstan inherited a northern region that was majority Russian. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan found themselves sharing a valley where no one could agree who owned which village. Uzbekistan ended up with enclaves completely surrounded by Kyrgyz territory. For 30 years, these problems simmered. In March 2022, just weeks after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Chinese surveyors were photographed working in the Pamir Mountains along the Tajik-Chinese border. Local herders reported seeing teams with laser equipment and GPS stations where no such work had been announced. The Tajik government issued no statement. Beijing said only that it was conducting routine geographic cooperation. By August 2023, a more specific leak emerged. A mid-level EU diplomat forwarded an internal cable to colleagues that mentioned a Sino-Russian working group on border rationalization, with focus on areas where cartographic ambiguities create security vulnerabilities. The cable noted that both Moscow and Beijing had separately approached Kazakhstan about technical corrections to shared boundaries. At the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in September 2023, President Putin and Xi held a private meeting that ran 90 minutes longer than scheduled. No readout was published. But 3 weeks later, Kyrgyzstan's president announced his country would welcome scientific cooperation on geographic modernization with its neighbors. The phrasing was odd. Modernization of what? The land hadn't moved. In November 2023, satellite imagery captured new road construction in areas marked as disputed between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. The roads didn't follow existing paths. They cut straight toward resource deposits, rare earth mining zones identified in Chinese geological surveys from 2021. Someone was building infrastructure before ownership was settled. Then in February 2024, a Kazakh opposition journalist in exile published photographs of what he claimed was a draft agreement between Astana and Beijing. The document proposed transferring 1,200 square kilometers of Kazakh territory in exchange for debt relief and water management investment. Kazakhstan's foreign ministry called it a fabrication, but they didn't deny that negotiations had occurred. The leaked EU cable has been verified by 3 separate journalists who received copies from different sources within the European diplomatic corps. The language used matches standard EU confidential reporting protocols. The diplomat who allegedly sent it was quietly reassigned to a different portfolio, though officials insist this was unrelated. The satellite imagery of road construction is unambiguous. Multiple commercial satellite operators captured the same sites on different dates. The roads exist. What remains disputed is who authorized them and whether they indicate planned territorial changes or simply improved access for existing settlements. The photographs of the alleged Kazakh-Chinese draft treaty are more complicated. 2 linguists with expertise in diplomatic Mandarin and Russian confirmed the terminology and format match authentic bilateral agreements. However, no original document has surfaced. only photographs of printed pages. The Kazakh government has never released the names of officials who allegedly participated in such talks. Local reports from herders and villagers in the Pamir region are consistent across dozens of interviews conducted by Radio Azadik, the Kyrgyz service of Radio Free Europe. People describe seeing foreign technical teams, military escorts, and new markers along ridgelines that previously had no official boundary posts. These are eyewitness accounts, not documents, but the details align. Academic researchers at the University of Central Asia published a paper in early 2024 examining historical Soviet maps versus current digital boundaries. They found over 40 locations where official maps from Russia, China, and Central Asian governments show different lines. Some discrepancies are minor. Others involve entire valleys. Not everyone agrees this represents a coordinated plan to redraw borders. Some analysts argue these are simply routine border demarcation efforts that every neighboring country conducts. China and Russia have resolved most of their own border disputes through decades of patient negotiation. Extending that model to help Central Asian neighbors clarify ambiguous lines could be seen as stabilizing, not threatening. Kazakhstan's government maintains that any discussions with neighbors about borders are transparent, legal, and involve only minor technical corrections measured in meters, not kilometers. They point out that small border adjustments happen globally all the time as surveying technology improves. The fact that some of these talks involve China or Russia doesn't automatically make them sinister. Several Western intelligence assessments, leaked to media in late 2023, expressed skepticism about the more dramatic claims. One U.S. State Department analysis noted that, while surveying activity has increased, evidence of imminent territorial transfers remains circumstantial. The assessment warned against conflating legitimate border clarification with forced annexation. The information gaps are significant. No government has released official maps showing proposed changes. No treaty text has been published. The diplomatic meetings that allegedly discussed these topics remain behind closed doors. What we have are fragments. Surveying activity, construction, leaked references, and nervous denials. The full picture is still obscured. For people living in these border regions, the uncertainty is the hardest part. Farmers in the Fergana Valley don't know whether their land will be in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, or Tajikistan next year. Water rights, grazing permits, and school districts all depend on which side of a line you're on. When that line becomes negotiable, daily life becomes impossible to plan. In interviews, residents describe a quiet anxiety. One Kyrgyz herder told a reporter that Chinese engineers asked him about seasonal migration routes through a mountain pass his family had used for generations. He didn't know whether he was helping with a map or giving away his future. There was no threat, just questions. And then the surveyors left. Communities that have coexisted across fuzzy borders for decades now worry about checkpoints, passports, and tariffs appearing where none existed before. The redrawing of borders in this region carries the weight of history. People remember the Soviet deportations. They remember when identities and nationalities were assigned by bureaucrats in distant capitals. The idea that it could happen again quietly through technical agreements is what keeps people awake. Border disputes in Central Asia operate like a three-dimensional chess game where the board itself keeps shifting. Every move affects water, roads, energy pipelines, and ethnic populations. When Russia and China cooperate on borders here, they're not just clarifying lines on a map. They're reshaping the architecture of Eurasian power. Think of it like this. If you own a house at the intersection of 3 properties, and 2 of your neighbors become business partners, suddenly the value of your driveway changes. Central Asian nations are that house. Their location gives them leverage. But if their 2 largest neighbors start coordinating, that leverage evaporates. The borders become less about geography and more about who controls access. This matters globally because these routes are alternatives to sea lanes. China's Belt and Road Initiative depends on stable land corridors through Central Asia. Russia wants to maintain influence in its former Soviet sphere. If they agree on borders that serve both their interests, it creates a unified bloc from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just what happens when neighbors with shared interests cooperate on infrastructure. The legal framework is murky. International law says borders can't be changed by force. But what about by mutual agreement under economic pressure? If Kazakhstan agrees to a land swap in exchange for debt relief, is that voluntary or coerced? The line between diplomacy and duress is subjective. And in Central Asia, where Russia and China are both economic lifelines and security guarantors, saying no to their proposals isn't simple. Here's what we know for certain. Surveying has increased. Roads are being built in disputed areas. Diplomatic discussions about borders have occurred. Documents and images suggesting formal agreements have leaked, though their authenticity is contested. What we don't know is whether these activities represent coordinated border changes or routine technical work being misinterpreted. The gap between those two possibilities is everything. One is standard international relations. The other is a quiet redrawing of Central Asia without most of the world noticing. And the people who would know the truth aren't talking. The next phase will determine which interpretation is correct. Border demarcation work will continue throughout 2025. Whether it leads to territorial changes or simply better maps, the surveying and road construction won't stop. These projects have momentum and funding. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan will likely face increasing pressure to formalize border agreements with China and Russia. This pressure will come disguised as economic opportunity, security cooperation, and infrastructure investment. Some agreements will be signed. How significant they are depends on what's actually in the text. Major territorial transfers probably won't be publicly announced. Even if borders change, they'll likely be framed as minor technical corrections or long overdue clarifications of Soviet-era ambiguities. The word redraw will never appear in official statements. The wild card is public reaction. If populations in affected areas believe their governments are surrendering territory under pressure, protests could force transparency. Central Asian governments are authoritarian but not immune to unrest. The question is whether people will know what's being negotiated before it's finalized. International observers will keep watching satellite imagery and cross-referencing it with diplomatic leaks. This story will unfold slowly, not through dramatic announcements but through roads appearing in new places, checkpoints moving a few kilometers, and updated maps that don't quite match the old ones. The hidden map might not redraw borders all at once, but it's changing how power works in a region that most of the world ignores until suddenly it can't. The lines that matter aren't always the ones we can see. Border demarcation work will continue throughout 2025. Whether it leads to territorial changes or simply better maps, the surveying and road construction won't stop. These projects have momentum and funding. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan will likely face increasing pressure to formalize border agreements with China and Russia. This pressure will come disguised as economic opportunity, security cooperation, and infrastructure investment. Some agreements will be signed. How significant they are depends on what's actually in the text. Major territorial transfers probably won't be publicly announced. Even if borders change, they'll likely be framed as minor technical corrections or long overdue clarifications of Soviet-era ambiguities. The word redraw will never appear in official statements. The hidden map might not redraw borders all at once, but it's changing how power works in a region that most of the world ignores until suddenly it can't. The lines that matter aren't always the ones we can see.